My name's Althea. I work on the privacy and scaling explorations team at the Ethereum Foundation. We work on a lot of applications of zero-knowledge proofs and other advanced cryptography. Obviously, a big focus on privacy and anonymity technologies, and also scaling ones, although the privacy is more pertinent to today's topic. We do kind of everything from pure research up to like proofs of concept and end user applications, so sort of playing with the whole stack. Rose, tell us about yourself. I think everybody has their own.
Has their own mic?
Yeah.
Okay, nice. So I'm Rose. I work on DarkFi, which I didn't really discuss in the talk much, but basically it's an environment that allows devs to create and deploy anonymous apps. And big part of kind of our interest is in anonymous schemas. So like, for example, if you're trying to do an AMM in a privacy context, it's not like simply that you can just do the exact same AMM implementation as you might have on ETH. So you actually have to engineer new schemas, new application logic. So we're very much into that. We call it anonymous engineering. So we want to build an environment that basically allows anonymous engineers to build applications. There you go.
Hi, I'm Henry. I'm the founder of Penumbra. We're building a shielded DEX and interchain privacy layer. Our theory is basically that in order to make privacy real, we need to find some initial sort of seed use cases where a private system can outcompete transparent alternatives on the merits. And so trading is kind of an interesting use case to build for, both because it's sort of an end-to-end sort of complete product and system, but it's also one where privacy is not just kind of an abstract principle or an abstract value that someone might have, but has a very quantifiable near-term financial value.
Hi, I'm Claire. As I mentioned earlier, I work on Nucleo, now Puzzle, as of about 30 minutes ago. And so I think Matt gave you a great description of kind of our position and how we've been working on privacy. And I work on the brand and partnership side, really thinking about what stories do we tell, who's privacy for, and how do we use kind of like all of the narrative tools in our toolkits to bring people in.
Awesome. So kind of the topic of our panel, or the title of our panel, right, is privacy, narrative, aesthetics, and memetics, which narrative being kind of like telling stories, right, literally like connecting things in a narrative fashion, aesthetics being maybe more about like sensory properties, sort of artistic techniques, and like both direct, trying to create moods with different colors and associations to the sort of tangible objects, and indirect, like what you were mentioning earlier, Claire, like associations to previous or existing movements, or like you mentioned protest aesthetics, or sort of the cyberpunk stuff, sci-fi. Like there are a lot of aesthetics that we kind of tap into, right, to like piggyback off those associations. And then memetics being sort of like viral ideas, and also the practice of like trying to create ideas or like package ideas in a way that makes them easier to spread, or like more likely to spread. So I first wanted to just kind of address like what even ties all of these things together, because they're not necessarily easily separable, but they're not exactly all the same thing either. But I think they are all kind of different sort of extra logical ways that sort of draw on associations and almost kind of exploit like cognitive tendencies of human beings to like help guide people toward certain conclusions, ways of action, or just like connecting things to values. And it's a way beyond making an explicit argument, or like a direct sort of like logical argument for your point, to sort of help people be more receptive, or to imagine themselves in the world that you want to create. So I guess to just open with that, does that make sense to you? Like, does that feel true, and kind of how do you think about that in the work that you do?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of like sharing of meaning between those three terms. I had someone approach me the last time I gave this speech, and said like, "Oh, you were talking about memes, but I feel like it would be better if you were talking about psyops, because psyops is something like more broad and general than memes, which like he saw as just like a visual signifier, whereas psyops is like a broader term that could encompass like narratives, aesthetics, and memetics." Which I would probably not talk about psyops, but maybe like a good concept to like unify these three tactics is propaganda in general. So now like we've kind of propaganda and marketing techniques are kind of blurred, but where you have nation states using marketing and vice versa, marketing's trying to do propaganda. But essentially the goal of propaganda is to change people's minds or like their ideas, but not just to influence them at the ideational level, but also to change their behavior. And that's like the really tricky thing. So yeah, I guess that's kind of what we're working on.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to me, I think about this idea that Dick Hebdig put out about punk, which is when you were talking about lunar punk and solar punk earlier. I was like, oh, that's kind of an interesting thread against this. But like, he's talking about punk and subculture in the meaning of style, and why style kind of is something that over time organically pops up among young people time and time again. And he's kind of basically saying like style means something. Style is a signifier of an identity. And identity is a signifier of a set of beliefs that talk about how you want to be in the world, what communities you want to build. And then he kind of flips it and he says, he kind of goes from there and he's looking at punk, and then he starts talking about the commodification of punk, and he talks about Hot Topic. And anyone who grew up, at least when I grew up, would have maybe have had a Hot Topic in their suburban California mall, like I did. But he kind of talks about that from the context of being like, there gets a point in an ideology where its aesthetics get so kind of crystallized that you can go and buy it. And what that is that's mainstream culture kind of like holding and reconciling what that thing is and putting it within its own narrative. And so I think like when we're talking about these narratives and when you're talking about like these visual symbols, I think it's an interesting space because it sits for me between marketing and propaganda and kind of almost into this place of language where I think, to me, when I think about like why I'm interested in looking at certain aesthetics in the context of privacy, I'm also thinking about like, how do I talk to people without telling them about the possibilities of what privacy can allow them to do? And maybe all of these different sort of like more subtle tools will allow people to then make associations that wouldn't have otherwise come up.
So one thing that I think is interesting, just like reflecting on these comments, is there's maybe a difference between different sort of goals of different memes. There's, in the crypto space, there's a lot of memes about products. I think that is often kind of like overplayed relative to its effect, right? Like, at the end of the day, something either like works or it doesn't, and people can use it or not. And having like really good branding or like a really good memes about something isn't actually enough to kind of carry the day if it turns out that the thing isn't actually useful. I've worked on privacy projects for a while, and I would say that a lot of those projects have kind of run into that problem of like, there's a really strong like vision of like, oh, here's like a thing that we could have, but the actual thing that gets built isn't quite there in terms of actually being able to be used. And for me, that kind of like turned me like away from the sort of like memetic focus, or like, let's not try and like hype up the kind of idea. Let's see if we can actually just like build a thing. And I guess where I've come to now is sort of coming kind of full circle on that is I think that the memes are actually much more effective in the space of like, how do you build the configuration of people who are working on the thing? And in that case, I think it's there's a huge amount of work involved in how do you get a whole group of people together, working together on towards some goal. In the crypto space, usually that's not all like, oh, everybody is in like one, hierarchically reporting company and the direction comes from the top or something. It's much more kind of lateral and bottom up. And I think that's really the kind of powerful case for like, how do you coordinate people to have aligned visions of what they are jointly creating?
Yeah, I think like an interesting like tension when working in any of these kind of spaces is and this came up as you're talking about like psyops or propaganda, like these things can be used to sort of inspire or they can be used to manipulate. And psyops and propaganda definitely sound a lot more like manipulation to me. But I think it's easy to like fall into those tactics even when you have good intentions, because like they tend to have like a more like a greater short-term impact. They get a lot of people to say or do a thing for a minute, but if they don't actually sort of change the way that people think or behave in a meaningful way, then they kind of get lost. So were you going to say something already to that?
I think that there's not a like what's the difference between like manipulation and coordination? I think that ultimately it ends up being kind of a value judgment of like, is this good or not? Or like another case is like coordination versus collusion. Like one kind of like sticking point that I have with, for instance, like Gitcoin, which otherwise like very cool base project. But there's sometimes this discussion of like, oh, how do we prevent people from like colluding in the voting or whatever? And it's like, well, on what basis do you have to say that like this is bad collusion that aka coordination that I don't like, whereas like otherwise this is like the good coordination. I think if you look at the activity, a lot of it ends up being similar.
Yeah. So I mean, when you said like, what's the difference between manipulation and coordination? Like one answer that comes to mind is like, when you stop yelling about it, do people continue doing it? Like when the meme dies, does like the change persist?
But I mean, like suppose that someone's sort of coordination is like, oh, I'm going to set up these like incentive structures. That's something that people talk about a lot. Like, oh, how do we create the incentive structures that are going to produce the outcomes that we want? I mean, if you're setting up if you're trying to construct incentives in order to get other people to believe that their self-interest, believe correctly or not, that their self-interest is producing your desired outcome, like, I don't know, is that really, like,
Did you want to add something?
Well, sorry, it wasn't really an answer to your question. I actually wanted to respond to something Claire said.
Totally. Like, please
okay.
feel free to respond to each other, ask your own questions.
It's kind of, only slightly related, but it is overall connected. So it's like this overall idea that like memes and narratives or whatever are a kind of destiny that like configures like the possibilities that are open to us, and like it's basically path dependent. So like certain memes produce certain outcomes, and so I think it's interesting you brought up the punk movement, especially that we're talking about cypherpunk and solarpunk and lunarpunk, which I gave a critique of cypherpunk, but you gave the exact same critique. It just perfectly maps onto punk, because basically cypherpunk inherited the memes of punk, which it basically inherited the meme of the anarchist movement in general, which was like the basically, and this is also partially how it ended up captured. So I just wanted to kind of note that I don't think capture is part of like the life cycle of movements or something. I think that if movements are successful and clear-headed, they can avoid capture. And that's an important point. And so where punk failed, and where cypherpunk also has issues, is like in this like subcultural kind of reactive negative position. If you listen to punk lyrics, there's like one, I think, what's that name of there's a song called, I think it's Subhumans, there's a song called No, And it's just like, no this, no that, no this, no that. And if you go to any like most squats or like squat villages like Exarchia, you'll see that the graffiti is very negative. It's all like demons and like, you know, like all this like images of violence, like weird like dolls with like head decapitated and like, you know, you're like, whoa, there's like some dark psychological stuff going on there. But it's all connected to the fact that punk was never actually proposing a vision. It was purely, wholly subcultural, and you know, like it didn't have like a revolutionary intent beyond this like just negative kind of celebration of the negative. So you know, I think privacy in general has inherited some of that memeplex through cypherpunk. I actually really liked Scott Moore's presentation this morning, who brought out that other aspect of cypherpunk, which is like, you know, much richer and you know, more generative and kind of a better direction for cypherpunk than this like purely individualist, kind of reactive and negative conception of privacy that has been, you know, promoted in some like cypherpunk paths in the cypherpunk like path dependency graph.
Yeah, that comes to a point that I would like us to touch on, like, and I think that's a really important point, that sort of like purely reactive narrative, and I don't know, it makes me think even of like Nietzsche's slave morality of like everything, your identity being all wrapped up in opposition to something else, and that gives that something else kind of all of the power, and also what if you win? Like, what are you now? What do you even do? At the same time, fear is a very powerful motivator. And there are some things like actually happening that really do scare the shit out of me. So like, where is this balance, or like, where do we kind of acknowledge, you know, mass surveillance being used to enable pretty horrific things, you know, like social and political manipulation all the way down to like genocide? Where does that kind of live in the narrative versus, yeah, being more positive, more generative, thinking more about what we want to create, what we want to embrace, what we want to move toward?
One perspective that I think is interesting to use to frame this is thinking about like what's involved in the sort of cognitive process of conflict. If you imagine sort of two entities engaged in some kind of conflict, struggle, adversarial interaction, right? Each of those entities needs to be modeling the behavior of the other, right? In order to win, you need to be able to anticipate what your adversary's move is going to be, and so you have to have some kind of like cognitive model. You have to have some kind of psychological identification with like, this is the you know, my model of my adversary, and then they also have that model of their adversary. And I think that this is where sometimes when two entities, people, groups are involved in conflict, sometimes you can end up kind of losing the kind of self-directed part of the cognition, because there's always like, oh, now I have like a copy of my adversary like living inside my brain, and in order to maintain that for long enough and with high enough fidelity to actually be able to like win that conflict, I have to have like somehow integrated like part of their thinking and thought process into my own. And I think that's a really interesting sort of tension in any kind of sort of like social struggle, is how does somebody like operate within some kind of environmental context and be responsive to that context enough to have their actions, you know, actually have effect, but not so much that they kind of lose the kind of kernel of generative thing of whatever it is that they're pushing for.
That's kind of reminding me of part of the conversation we had a little bit earlier, where someone threw out the prompt of, you know, why is privacy kind of coded darkly? And as you were talking about that, I was thinking about the idea that maybe some of the things that we can do with the visual worlds that we do, or the narrative worlds that we do, is set up the parameters for the conflict and conversations and kind of like frameworks that we want to be thinking and battling against. But also, I would love to kind of go back to that conversation we were having earlier and talk a bit about like what would happen if privacy wasn't coded darkly. Like what are other positions that it could be kind of dimensionalized to look like?
Right, because you're talking about this sort of adversarial mindset and making some fascinating points about it, but there's also like an aspect of privacy or a view on privacy that is much more about connection and intimacy and about sort of creating spaces where there is no adversary to even worry about in the first place, and this very like humanizing element of it, that things happen between people away from, like inside of sort of concentric containers, such that there's space for natural, human, intimate, like non-adversarial reaction or interactions to even take place at all.
Yeah. Like when we were talking earlier, you mentioned the idea of a blanket fort, and like what are the and laugh at it, but you know, I think it's an amazing metaphor for the reasons that like if you start thinking about what has to happen for us to be in a blanket fort and have the sense of like intimacy and safety, what are the other things that have to sit around that blanket fort in order for that safe thing to be a reality? I thought it was like a really beautiful metaphor, and definitely like brings out a different angle on what privacy might be.
I just wanted to bring up like a word that I like from the Irish language, which is comrún. Rún in Irish means a secret, and comrún means a shared secret, but it also means like a common purpose. So, you know, I really see privacy and anonymity as being kind of like the natural barrier within a community, similar to how language is. So, you know, that's why like I try to define anonymity in this positive way of like, you know, building divergent communities and allowing society to realize its own moral, political destiny. Just also quickly respond, like you brought up slave morality from Nietzsche, and I really liked Henry's. You know, we mentioned the way that your enemy is like encoded within, and so Nietzsche does talk about this, and he basically says like, there's the master and then there's the slave, and what the slave does is it basically copies the master's morality and then flips it. So it says like, okay, the master says that thing, I'm saying the opposite thing. But it's like the slave, in like trying to escape this, the master-slave dialectic, is just shadowing. It becomes like a shadow copy of the master. And this is like one explanation for why we have this like cycle of failed revolutions, where, you know, there's an attempt at a revolution and the revolution ends up just being the next, you know, dictatorship and replacing the former regime. What Nietzsche says, like the way to escape the master-slave dialectic, and like the way, the exit is to become like what he calls a philosopher of the future, and a philosopher legislator. And what this philosopher should do is like carefully study what are the different forces that are present in general. Like that could be like a memetic force, could be technical forces, and think about like what are their interactions and their interplays. And through this like careful analysis, which like has its roots in another philosopher thinker called Spinoza, who's like, we need to know things really well and like study the things. He through this process of study and becoming aware of the different forces that you're contained in, you can actually commandeer an exit from the master-slave dialectic. Just want to put that out there.
Well, I guess one point that I wanted to just branch off of what Althea said is, I think that the idea of like privacy as a space for like safety and intimacy versus privacy in the context of kind of adversarial interactions are not necessarily opposed, but complementary to each other. I think that, unfortunately in the world, predatory behavior of all kinds is real. And so whenever there's a space that is, like a space of safety or intimacy, at some level, that space is like maintained through some kind of like, self-defense or immune reaction to a potentially hostile outside world. And I think one of the ways that I see sort of like the task of society is being able to scale those mechanisms. But I think for that reason, those two frames are actually kind of complementary rather than oppositional. And especially if your goal is like, I want to realize a possible future world where there are more spaces of safety and intimacy, then relative to the society that we have, then you are actually in a kind of adversarial relationship with society as it's currently structured.
Yeah, which, and I didn't mean to like call you out, because that was sort of my original question, right? Was like both of these things really exist sort of either in harmony or in tension with each other, depending on, I guess, how you think about it. But yeah, it is like similar to, if you think of, I don't know, violence as another thing that society maybe sort of creates like layers of protection against, right? Where like when you're in your blanket fort, you don't have to think about whether violence is going on because you've thought about that when you built your house, and someone thought about that also in constructing like the town or like the area where your house exists and the country within that, and then the sort of like global like environment that you live in. That like all of these layers exist so that the space can exist. But I guess it makes me wonder whether there is a narrative that can actually serve all of this, or if this is like that we need to have kind of different stories that we tell to different people, different memes that we spread in different places, depending on sort of like what people are able to see or what people are already experiencing. And yeah, how we think about like different audiences.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I always feel like the story that you tell has to be fit to the people that you're talking to. And, right now in privacy, that's probably a closer audience, right? It's more like people who sit in this room because that's where the technology and the actual product that we can deliver on in a way that people are, going to be able to use, like those are the folks who we can reach. But I do think it's important to like, as we're starting to build these aesthetics and starting to build these stories, also think about who the future users can be and how we create spaces and like cultural narratives around privacy, around crypto in general, that also allow people who maybe aren't in this room to look at it and think, okay, there's like something there that could be for me. Or if I'm gonna build something in the future, if I have a community I wanna reach, this is a suite of technologies that 5 years down the line, when I'm starting to do that, I look at and think about. And I think one of the interesting challenges with crypto right now is that I think we've done a really good job of reaching a core group and maybe have some thinking to do about how we start to reach out further.
Yeah, and I wonder if that is, it's partly reaching out, but it's also sort of telling stories about who we are and why we're doing what we're doing, right? And I think that narrative or like, that message is probably less about the technology and more about the very concept of privacy.
Totally, or about like novel use cases that tap on the things that people care about that aren't privacy, that privacy might just be one part of it. A friend recently told me that he's a researcher and he works on harm reduction, and he interviews people in the fields and really is like out there on the streets talking to folks who are drug users, active ones, who most of the harm reduction tactics are happening in the field. But we were talking the other day and he was like, have you heard of dark forest? And I was like, yes, why are you asking me about it? And he started talking about how there's a harm reduction community that's sprung up on dark forest, not because they're specifically interested in dark forest, but because they're interested in the capability of that being a space where they can have a conversation that has these sort of qualities of privacy that achieve specific goals. I think that's like a really interesting story to start telling that allows people to kind of like unlock different behaviors, because privacy is part of it, but it's more about like real human goals.
Yeah, I think like we're at an interesting moment where there's kind of we're kind of in a speciation phase for privacy, also in crypto in general. But I notice it a lot with the privacy tech where there's many projects doing similar things but like different configurations of the same thing, and they often have like slightly different variations of the vision, and like different stories that they'll tell, and different user bases that they're catering to. So at the beginning when I was like confronted with like how much like increasing speciation there is, I was like, maybe we're actually losing, like we're becoming like factionalizing and losing our power in this process, and maybe we need to be like more unified and work together. But then maybe it's like some kind of evolutionary process where these different like market niches are being explored, similar to how you have like niches within evolution. And similarly to evolution, like there will be like speciation, there will also be sex. So like different like protocols and technological directions coupling, like combining with each other, like creating new ones. And then, in the same way, like mass extinction events, where like some evolutionary paths just like get like cut off at some point, like for whatever reason. So yeah, I kind of think that like when it comes to the narratives and also to the specific technical implementations, it's a speciation phase. So I don't think we'll see as many privacy projects as we do in the futures that we have now. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we'll have like hyper-pluralism. That would be good too.
Just as an aside, do you find that like thinking and working in the space of memetics, you start to see things in terms of evolution more than you used to?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think about evolution in terms of memes and in terms of software, and in general, I think it's just like a pattern, I think it's just like some kind of aspect of nature, these evolutionary processes.
Another point there too is that the context that these privacy projects are being developed in is also evolving, right? So one thing that I think is an interesting example is if you look at the design of Zcash, when Zcash was made, the state of the crypto ecosystem in, say, 2016 was quite different, right? You had all these different blockchains, and each of them sort of had to be this completely self-contained, individuated ecosystem, and you can only go between them basically through a centralized exchange. And so every ecosystem has to have its own, set of like, okay, here are all the exchange integrations. Here are the like smart contract system. Everybody, everybody's making an L1. Everybody has to have their L1 do everything. And now we have fairly mature technology for doing cross-chain interoperability, and that permits greater specialization and speciation, right? So for Penumbra, we don't have to have this like, oh, here's the transparent part of the chain that you use to talk to an exchange, because our transparent ecosystem is like every IBC compatible chain. And so as the ecosystem in the rest of crypto matures, I think that it also creates new niches and opportunities for privacy projects to kind of slot into. Another interesting kind of like future convergence, I think, is between privacy and scaling. I think it's kind of underappreciated because generally projects today either do ZK proofs for a privacy goal or for a scalability goal. But fundamentally, the way that you're going to achieve privacy using zero-knowledge proofs is, okay, you take the execution of whatever state changes there are, you move that all the way out to sort of the edge of the network onto the end-user device, and then you have them just sort of send back these proofs and certifications of what data they're sending. And so you can see that there's some kind of scalability benefit where if you could actually make that work, then the center of the network doesn't have to be processing everybody's data because it can't see it anyway. And on the other hand, from a scaling point of view, You could imagine sort of like, okay, suppose we had this like platonic ideal of like the most scalable system ever. Then definitionally, every participant in that system is not going to be learning any information about any other user's activity, because that's not information that they, strictly speaking, need to know, and so communicating it is not, the theoretically optimal scalable system. So those two things, I think, are going to come together in a big way, although they're currently viewed, I think, more as being separate sort of lines of development.
Yeah, they definitely sort of need each other, but I feel like there's this interesting, I think, a shift that needs to happen sort of in like normie society, but maybe also a little bit in like the blockchain world of like, there's just the like overarching question of who needs to know what, when, and in both of those spheres, there's a little bit of a tendency toward the extreme of like everyone, or at least someone, needs to know everything all the time. And on the blockchain, it's sort of like everyone, everything all the time. In the normie world, it's maybe more like somebody, specifically the government or the good guys need to be able to see everything that happens all of the time, because that's the only way that we'll ever be safe. But yeah, I wonder how we sort of like counter that. And like, this is, I don't know, another kind of question that I wanted to bring up here was like, and we only have a few minutes left, but when we're talking about these like ways of communicating that kind of are maybe at heart a bit manipulative and definitely a bit more emotional than logical, like, are there sort of self-awareness memes, or is that like almost a contradiction? Like, can you manipulate someone into thinking for themselves?
For sure. I mean, yeah, this is kind of where I said in the talk, like, that the emphasis, the narrative focus should be more on like self-empowerment and self-determination, and these kind of and raising people up. That's also like basically a meme that comes from free software, which free software basically argues that in a proprietary system, the relationship between the developer and the user is basically one of exploitation, where the developer has full control and the user is basically operated by the software that they have no control over, and they don't understand. Which is the paradigm that we live in for the most part. Crypto is an exception. So that I think that what free software says to do is like, you need to kind of step up, become self-sovereign, and like become a developer, essentially, like to close the loop between the users and the developers, where users are developers and vice versa. So that power distinction does not exist, because in principle the users can read the code and so forth. So I think that crypto has to some extent done a good job at like putting that at the center of its messaging. So yeah, I think that's a good meme.
Yeah, I also think like the aesthetics that you choose are a way of giving different folks like a platform and a space. I don't think it necessarily has to be like intrinsically manipulative, but I think when you are going out into the world and picking your memes, essentially picking the coded language you choose to use, you also get to choose like who's in and who's inside that code, and who that is able to like read and kind of interpret it. And like when I think about crypto, I think, we have this like kind of really rich, let's say like narrative and story about software, which is a really strong platform to give some people a sense of sovereignty and some people a sense of being able to kind of be a part of that discourse. I think if we are to start to shift some of the aesthetic and use metaphors that different groups of people are able to get, you'll bring in also other people, not necessarily in a manipulative way, but in a way that allows them to kind of also come to the table with, let's say, like a bank of knowledge that lets them engage.
Yeah, like I think of all of these things in terms of not just manipulation, but also like world building, and like you were saying, sort of like creating possible paths to the future, right? And you can build those worlds, you can like construct those metaphors, those narratives, those associations, whatever, in ways that place people in a place of like agency and responsibility, or in a place of powerlessness, hopelessness, and sort of passivity. So I think, yeah, like how we construct those worlds is really can impact how people then approach the other elements, right? Are they NPCs, or are they like gods, or something in between? And we're all zeros now. We're out of time. But thank you all so much. This has been really interesting. I hope we can continue this convo.
Thank you.
Thank you.